This is chapter 2 of Owen Barfield's Speaker's Meaning. The title of the chapter is Imagery in Language and Metaphor in Poetry. I've underlined about maybe 50% of the chapter or something crazy like that. So I'm going to try to read through this without taking too many rabbit trails, but maybe take some sidebars on things where I think maybe he's unclear, or just trying to connect things or making it a little bit easier to highlight his thought. All right, so here we begin. One of the points I made and indeed insisted on in the previous chapter was that if we are really convinced that the so-called meaning of language is simply the way in which it is normally used by normal people, then short of putting on blinkers, we cannot avoid seeing that the meanings of a great many words change as time goes on. There are, moreover, certain characteristic changes, one of which is contraction. The meaning of the word or the extension of the term shrinks, so that it comes to denote, as has happened with the word furniture, which is the example used in the previous chapter, only one particular part of some larger area or category, the whole of which it formerly included. Of course, this is not the only way in which the meanings of words change in course of time. There is also the opposite way, which may be called expansion. Somehow or other, a word or phrase begins to mean more or much more than it has meant hitherto. An interesting example of this would be gravity and its more recent companion, gravitation. Down to the 17th or 18th century, gravity in its physical sense, we can omit the psychological one, was virtually a synonym for heaviness or weight, the quality which leads solid objects to seek the center of the earth. Whereas since Newton's time, both words have come to mean, when normally used by normal people, a force or law operative not only in the sublunary sphere, but throughout the wide open spaces of the universe. Another example would be the word focus, a Latin word adopted into English, and a term mainly used in optics and geometry. In classical Latin, focus was the word for hearth. I think that's how you say that word. I want to say, it looks like hearth, but I think you say it hearth, the fireplace. And in particular, the fire burning on the hearth. It continued to have the same restricted meaning in medieval Latin until the astronomer Kepler, writing in Latin, made use of it for his own purposes. With its adoption into English, the earlier meaning was dropped altogether. Both these examples, as is appropriate in a scientific age, are taken from the progress of science. That is, in the context, accidental, but it makes them particularly useful examples because here we know what was going on and can therefore actually observe the impact of the speaker's meaning on lexical meaning, which brought about the change. It is not often as clear or as sharp as this. Generally, it takes more than one speaker to bring the change about. In fact, it is usually an event that occurs over an extended period in the anonymous traffic of conversation and letters. Only in a rare case, here and there, can we actually trace the first speaker or writer to have set the process going. But the word focus does seem to be such a case, just such a case. Kepler appears to have been the first to employ it in its now generally accepted sense as the quasi-center of a geometrical figure, the focus of an ellipse. And it is thought that in doing so he had in mind that point in a lens or parabolic mirror of which the sun's rays are concentrated, so that it becomes a burning glass. The burning point, we might say, as the fire in the hearth is a burning point, to gather the warmth and light of the sun, where it all comes from, into the cold and darkness of earth. A good many years ago, the American psychologist J. M. Baldwin remarked that, quote, "The development of thought is by a method essentially of experimentation, of the use of meanings as worth more than they are as yet recognized to be worth. The individual must use his own thoughts, his established knowledges, his grounded judgments for the embodiment of his new inventive constructions. He erects his thought, as we say, schematically, projecting into the world an opinion still peculiar to himself, as if it were true. Thus all discovery proceeds." End quote. And it is really apparent of itself that all radical progress does depend on just this interaction between an individual speaker's meaning and the lexical or normal meaning to which Baldwin was pointing when he spoke of what the meaning was as yet recognized to be worth. Arthur Koestler, in his book The Sleepwalkers, mainly a history of astronomy, went so far as to maintain that if the analytical rules for the use of language as a means of communication had been strictly enforced in Newton's time, the law of gravity could never have been discovered, or if discovered, could not have been imparted. That's a very interesting and rather serious claim, that language is so kind of fundamental to the ways in which we think, that it greatly both limits and guides the patterns of thinking that are available to us, which this is obviously linked to what another phenomenon that Barfield takes great pains to go into in other books about the evolution of consciousness. Anyway, this sounds like an amusing exaggeration, and perhaps it is, but let us not be too absolutely sure of it. Newton's law is very familiar, and with the hindsight of familiarity, it is naturally difficult not to feel that there must have been many ways of putting it across without altering the meaning of the word gravity. Yet progress, that is, radical progress, and not just hardware improvements, progress involving change, does come about only when we question, and because we question, our fundamental assumptions. Moreover, and this is a crucial point to which I shall return, the most fundamental assumptions of any age are those that are implicit in the meanings of its common words. In our time, these happen to be largely the assumptions of 19th century positivism. In Newton's time, however, they were the assumptions of Aristotelian, that is, medieval and pre-medieval philosophy, cosmology, and science. In Newton's time, an Aristotelian universe was not simply a set of theories in which men believed. It was what half of their keywords implicitly meant. Thus, if we really want to put ourselves in their shoes, back at that stage in history of thought, we must practice thinking, not only about such a thing as gravitation, which is easy for us, but rather about something which is correspondingly difficult. Only in that way can we hope to understand their difficulty in thinking about gravitation at all. To think of gravity, or of terrestrial physics of any sort, as extending beyond the orbit of the moon was difficult for them in the same way that it is difficult for us to think of mind or mental activity or intelligence of any sort outside of some particular physical brain. Contrariwise, this which is so difficult for us was something that caused them no difficulty at all. It was the sort of thing that the relevant words meant, whereas for us, the very same words mean the opposite thing. The word, quote-unquote, thought, for instance, means, for most people, something rather like cigarettes inside a cigarette box called the brain. One good reason for troubling to concentrate on the moment of change of meaning is that it directs our attention, awakens us to fundamental assumptions so deeply held that no one even thinks of making them explicit. Try thinking and speaking about thought or thoughts in the old way if you want to experience how difficult it must have been before the scientific revolution to think about physics in the new way. So much then for expansion of meaning and its dependence on the interaction of speaker's meaning and lexical meaning. But there is also the opposite phenomenon of contraction, which we looked at first. In Baldwin's terminology, there is also, quote, the use of words as worth, and then he puts this in brackets, less, as opposed to more, than they are as yet recognized to be worth. That must also have been brought about by the operation of speaker's meaning on lexical meaning. But there is an important difference here. Whereas expansion of meaning can be seen to be the product of mental activity of individual speakers, contraction of meaning can also be, it generally is, the product of their passivity. It is more often the product of something like force of habit, or rather the inertia of habit. Here, the parallel discipline that is best able to help us is not history, but literature. I mean, in particular, that part of the study of literature, which used to be called, and is still sometimes called rhetoric. One of the topics with which rhetoric deals is the use of quote-unquote figurative language. And a figurative or metaphorical use of language is the normal means by which expansion of meaning comes about. It is another name for what happens when a speaker succeeds in making a word mean, quote, more than it is as yet recognized, end quote, to mean. Kepler used the word focus, and Newton used the word gravity metaphorically at the time, though they are no longer metaphors for us. Dr. Hugh Blair, who lectured on rhetoric in the 18th century, illustrated his remarks on figurative language with a single sentence that happens to contain a number of different examples of it. Quote, "Those persons who gain the hearts of most people who are chosen as the companions of their softer hours, and their reliefs from anxiety and care, are seldom persons of shining qualities or strong virtues. It is rather the soft green of the soul on which we rest our eyes, that are fatigued with beholding more glaring objects." End quote. If we examine the sentence more closely, we observe not only that it contains plenty of examples of figurative language, but also that they are examples of different kinds and degrees of figurative language. And I think it becomes apparent on reflection that they are at the same time examples of different proportions in the relation between lexical meaning and speaker's meaning. Thus, in the expression, the soft green of the soul, we ourselves have to do a little imaginative work in order to find ourselves looking through a lexical meaning to a speaker's meaning. For no merely dictionary meaning of the word green is normally applicable to the soul. Something the same is perhaps true of the word shining in the expression shining qualities, and again of softer in softer hours. But look more closely and you find still other examples this time of expressions which are in some degree figurative, but less palpably so. Those persons who gain the hearts. Could we safely say that the use made here of the verb gain or of the noun hearts is not figurative? To reflect a little even on such a commonplace expression as strong virtues is to be reminded that the epithet strong has two very different meanings, the one signifying only physical strength, the other properly usable in context of quite a different order. Is the second use figurative or not? I spoke just now of looking through one sense of a word to another, and I suggest that what is most characteristic of figurative language as a whole is precisely this translucence. Nor do I think that the problem of meaning in general can be usefully tackled without a close look at this phenomenon. But here the historical dimension obtrudes itself on our notice again, whether we like it or not. For instance, I describe the figurative expression, strong virtues, as a commonplace one. It is so commonplace that, in this case, the figurative language hardly strikes us as being figurative at all. If we do say that, however, we have let fall a remark whose significance extends far beyond the confines of the art of rhetoric. It takes us, indeed, straight to the kernel of language itself, considered in its historical aspect. Or rather, it demonstrates the essentially historical nature of language. It reminds us that whatever pragmatical advantages may be won by treating language for particular and limited purposes quite unhistorically, its true nature cannot be grasped with exclusion. Its true nature cannot be grasped with exclusion of the time dimension. This, I think, is the fundamental thing in Barfield's work. And when you think about it, really, we are forced by the limitations of time and space, our limited mental bandwidth and framework, to most of the time when we're dealing with language, we have to kind of deal with it in its very prosaic and present forms of the possibilities of what it can mean. You don't have the mental bandwidth to try and consider this endless historical development of a particular word and grant that all those possible meanings might be present in the word that you're using now, because it's too difficult. It's not possible for even very smart people to do. So we necessarily constrict it for practical reasons. But what he's saying here is that, well, to really understand language as a phenomenon, we have to do the opposite, which is somewhat difficult, to expand our reach into the history of words. Historically observed, the outstanding feature of language and its semantic aspect turns out to be the fact that words which were once figurative have ceased to be so, and words that are still figurative are ceasing to be so. Fortunately, the later part of the process is one we are able, with the help of some literary taste, to trace even into its finer details. Look, for example, at the phenomenon of the cliché. During World War I, Great Britain was, according to Mr. Lloyd George and the journalist of the day, continually either in the trough of the wave or on the crest of it. Usually, if I remember right, in the trough. Explore every avenue. Leave no stone unturned. The cliché is a kind of tired metaphor, a piece of language on which the passivity of habit, or as Coleridge called it, the lethargy of custom, has been at its eroding and contracting work. It has become too commonplace to retain any poetic life as an image, but not common enough to have turned into an inoffensive, recognized, quote-unquote, figure of speech. So that you have what has really become a dull lexical meaning, equivalent in the first instance given to something like in great difficulties, pretending, as it were, to retain a spark of speaker's meaning behind it. Whereas in the case of such a recognized figure of speech, as, say, in dire straits, there is no such pretense. A cliché will in time either be abandoned or it will turn into a trope, as these recognized figures of speech are sometimes called, and become part of the gear and tackle of reputable discourse. But even when that has happened, the history of a cliché is not necessarily at an end. It may come to be used so often that it ceases to be even conventionally figurative. It may reach a stage where there is no longer any translucence, or even pretended or half-remembered translucence. And just to remember, translucence is the seeing through from one meaning into another that he was referring to as the kind of key phenomenon of language. Of one, or even pretended or half-remembered translucence, of one concomitant meaning through another, so that what began long ago by being a new and distinguishable inner or immaterial meaning of a phrase or word will have become its only meaning. We have already seen how meanings are contracted by speakers simply dropping part of them altogether. Emerson was one of those who pointed out that this was the process by which the greater part of our modern vocabulary has been produced. Quote, as the limestone of the continent, end quote, he wrote in his essay, The Poet, quote, consists of infinite masses of the shells of animalcules, so language is made up of images or tropes, which now in their secondary use have long ceased to remind us of their poetic origin, end quote. But Emerson was not alone. It may conceivably be argued that the expression in material meaning is not a very satisfactory one. It is, however, not possible to treat of language historically without finding a terminology of some sort for the contrast I am referring to. Material and immaterial, concrete and abstract, physical and mental, outer and inner. We can choose which we like. On the whole, I prefer outer and inner. But I have purposely taken the terms material and immaterial from Jeremy Bentham because he was one of the founding fathers of a very different view of language from the one I hold myself. He could almost be called a kind of paleological positivist, since he also tells us how the immaterial language is erroneously taken by most people to refer to, quote-unquote, fictitious entities. Bentham, in his essay on language, puts it as follows, quote, throughout the whole field of language, parallel to the line of what may be termed the material language and expressed by the same words, runs a line of what may be termed the immaterial language. Not that to every word that has a material import there belongs also an immaterial one, but that to every word that has an immaterial import there belongs, or at least did belong, a material one. End quote. Whatever else you have in language in its history then, you certainly have a process by which words with a material or outer meaning somehow turn into words with only an immaterial or inner one. It has of course been pointed out over and over again that all our words for mental processes, grasp, conceive, understand, etc., can be traced back historically to an earlier stage when they also signified a material process. A very little etymological investigation is enough to reveal that the same thing applies to that whole vast vocabulary of abstractions on which not only the philosophers but the critics, sociologists, politicians, and journalists of today rely so heavily for that purpose of communicating, whatever they communicate. And then he has a bunch of examples here. Approach, aspect, attitude, condition, development, dimension, dynamic, expression, influence, inhibition, intention, integrity, nostalgia, opposition, progressive, reactionary, relative, seminal, trend, vision, and so on ad infinitum. In all the examples of immaterial language which I have cited, we are faced with the end product of a completed process. If we want to try and contemplate the process itself and not merely its end product, we must clearly look for instances where it is not yet completed. There is no lack of them. Our excursion into the art of rhetoric merely helped us to examine microscopically a process which is at work in ordinary speech. Take, for example, that group of words which have to do, or as Bentham might say, at least did once have to do, with a man's rank in society, his outward station. In the case of words such as chivalrous, courteous, and gentle, and of course of their opposites, villainous, vulgar, etc., we have again mere end products of the process, but we may still notice that in some of the cases its final completion was much more recent than in others. There are circles in England where, for example, the adjective gentle, especially in its compounds gentleman, gentlewoman, may still be used to denote, or certainly to connote, social position rather than moral quality. In the case of the word noble, moreover, while the process I have been speaking of is so far advanced it is impossible to say it is completed, though it is nearly so, the concomitant meanings of outer and inner are still just available. Mostly one uses the word noble to signify high moral character and nothing else. But a member of the House of Lords is still referred to in the chamber as a noble lord, without any reference at all to his moral standing. One can quite well imagine a Labour peer remarking in the course of his speech, "We regard the noble lord and his supporters as vermin beneath our notice." Here, there may well be a difference between English and American usage, so that if it were the latter we're considering, we should have to say that their transition from outer to inner has been completed, whereas in England it has not. But even in America, I should say that the word bourgeois still has exactly the same curious and unfixed concomitants of social and moral senses that I have pointed to in the case of noble. Perhaps already in Russia, but the point is that you cannot altogether separate meaning from the history of meaning. And just to quickly point out, he's writing this all in the 60s, so already we can kind of see that we're at a little bit of a remove from some of the examples he's referring to, so that they're less maybe palpable and present for us, given the ongoing evolution of language. In such cases, then, one may observe the process of contraction still actually at work in its various stages, but it is not limited to the domain of sociology or to any other domain. It has been at work throughout the whole of language. As Bentham reminded us, look far enough back into the history of almost any word of the inner or immaterial language, and you can come to a period when it had an outer meaning as well. So that its history is, at least in that respect, the story of a contraction of meaning. It is much less generally realized that the same thing is true of the outer or material language. This also is an end product. This also we owe to the process of contraction. Words which for us today have an outer meaning only, formerly had the inner as well. Moreover, the process by which they have lost their inner meaning is clearly the obverse or correlative of the very process by which so many other words have lost their outer meaning. Both processes may be well illustrated by the histories of such terms as breath or air or wind and spirit. For here they happen to be sharply pointed by a well-known record from a period when they were not as yet completed. In the English version of St. John's Gospel, chapter 3, we find the following 3 verses in which both terms are employed alternately. Verse 6, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. Marvel not that I said unto thee, ye must be born again. The wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, and whither it goeth. So is everyone that is born of the Spirit. Probably most people read the first part of verse 8 as a metaphor comparing the Spirit with the wind. But if we turn to the Greek, we find it is not so. The same word pneuma is employed throughout, though it has been rightly translated first as spirit, then as wind, and then again as spirit. In Hellenistic Greek, pneuma still conveyed the concomitant meanings, but the English translators had to split it into 2 words, one of which, spirit, had since lost its outer meaning, while the other, wind, had lost its inner meaning. In such a word as heart, on the other hand, and it is only one of many examples, we still feel the 2 meanings concomitant in modern English usage. Heart is very commonly used to signify a physical organ conceived as exclusively physical. It is used even more commonly to signify the inner feelings of a man, as is apparent from the adjectives often annexed to it: warm, cold, hard, soft, etc. Now, the ordinary way of putting it is to say that when we speak of someone having a warm heart or a cold heart, we are using figurative language, using imagery. And that will do well enough as long as we do not assume that it is the same thing as saying we are using a metaphor. For the plain truth is that we use the word heart as we do, not because we are poets, but because the word itself has a history. It is that all language has been, and some still is, imagery, in the sense that one meaning is apprehended transpiring through another. This is, again, the translucence he's talking about. We look back and we find concomitant meanings or uncontracted meanings that have since become and are for us now separable and concomitant. We find an inner meaning or transpiring or showing in some way through the outer. Non-figurative language, on the other hand, is a late arrival. What we call literal meanings, or whether inner or outer, are never samples of meaning in its infancy. They are always meanings in their old age, end products of a historical process. That at least is what we find if we look back into the past as far as the study of language itself will take us. What we may choose to infer about some earlier period or about the origin of speech, on the basis of other studies such as biology or anthropology, is, as we shall see later, another matter. The words image and imagery are extremely hard worked just now, and are themselves used with a great variety of meanings. I intend when I use them that particular sense according to which they signify the transpiring or translucence of an inner meaning through an outer, which we have been discussing. This is the sense in which they are largely, though not exclusively, used in the study and criticism of poetry. We are again therefore brought to a point at which the parallel discipline of literature can be of use to us in investigating the nature of language, provided we use it with proper caution. We have, for instance, been hearing a good deal in the last few decades of Mr. Eliot's objective correlative. of the poet's search for objects, shapes, patterns, events in the outer world, which can image in some undefined way the inner experience he feels impelled to express. When I referred above to quote-unquote concomitant meanings, I qualified rather uneasily by adding or uncontracted meanings that have since become and are for us now separable and concomitant. In doing so, I implied, of course, that you can perhaps also have meanings that are multiple or complex without being separable. And this problem, too, has invited a great deal of attention from those interested in the study or the theory of poetry. Those in particular who find in the poet's use of ambivalent or multivalent language his chief distinguishing mark as a poet. From both these points of the compass, attention is often directed on the use of figurative language in poetry, on the use of simile, metaphor, and symbol. The three are very much alike, but they differ in the degree to which their soft focus can or cannot be separated by analysis into distinctly focused quote-unquote meanings. They are all of them forms of utterance characterized by a certain tension between expression and communication. And it would not be difficult to show that it is in metaphor where the concomitant meanings are less separable than in simile, but more so than in symbol, that this tension is at its highest, though it would take us too far afield to do so. So he's talking about the degrees to which these different symbol, metaphor, simile, how there's kind of degrees to which there's this tension between the literal meaning of something versus the speaker's meaning is in tension with each other. Perhaps for that reason, the term metaphor is sometimes loosely used to cover all three of them, simile, metaphor, and symbol. Clearly, there is a close connection between the poet's use of metaphor, his choice of an objective correlative to express the hitherto unexpressed, and that particular instance of the operation of speakers on lexical meaning, which I classified as expansion. This is where the meaning of a word comes to grow over time. Or rather, there is more than a close connection. The two are virtually identical. The motivation may be different. The psychological process is the same when a poet uses a vigorous metaphor to express, as Shelley put it in his defense of poetry, the hitherto unapprehended relations of things. Or, when in another sphere, Kepler uses the word focus in an entirely new way to embody his own new apprehension. Both of them have to use words as worth more than they are as yet recognized to be worth. In both cases, language is being employed in what I would call, in its widest sense, the poetic mode. Now, this use of metaphor is fairly common today, especially in poetry. It happens, therefore, that we are all fairly familiar with this particular species of the genus imagery. This particular species being the expansive operation of an individual speaker's meaning on the lexical meaning of a word or phrase. It is, I believe, for that reason that a certain rash and, in my view, erroneous conclusion has been drawn by a very large number of people. Thus, it is frequently said, and even more frequently assumed, without being said, that throughout the whole history of language, and particularly in its early stages, the use of words as metaphors has been responsible not only for the expansion of meaning, as we have been noticing, but also for its contraction. More precisely, what in fact arose by contraction is assumed to have been arisen. What in fact arose by contraction is assumed to have arisen by expansion. We find a word in a dead language or in a primitive language that signifies both wind or breath and spirit or soul, or we find in our own time a word such as heart, Here are concomitant meanings. How did these words come to have these concomitant meanings in the first place? Oh, because at some remote stage of unrecorded history, some individual speaker thought it would be a good thing to use the word wind as a metaphor for spirit, or the word heart as a metaphor for feeling. Such is the very widespread assumption. We are all familiar with the use of metaphor in modern sophisticated languages, and particularly with the use of it to express the inner experience through the outer image. And we are also familiar with the way in which metaphors first fade by repeated use and then sometimes fade into actual meanings. So we go on to infer from all this that we know the way in which inner meaning of any sort first found its way into language, and even that we know the way in which inner language arose at all in the first place. We say it arose by the way of metaphor. But that will not do. In order to have a metaphor, you must begin by being aware of at least two meanings or sets of meanings, which, however vague and ill-defined they may be in themselves, are not vaguely but sharply distinguished from one another. First, the lexical or normal meaning, and secondly, the speaker's meaning, which you now intend the word or phrase figuratively to bear. In order, therefore, to perform the deliberate act of making the outer become a vehicle for the inner, you must first have a word with an exclusively outer meaning. But nothing is to be got from the study of language that indicates either that such meanings existed in early times or that they are found today in primitive speech. So what he's saying is that we can't find this sort of literal version of meanings where like this thing has this very, very defined and specific outer set of things that just as a pointer to the physical world that in primitive speech, or when we go back and look at older languages. And this is an interesting claim of his, which I think I'd like to examine more and look at some. I know there's a lot of interesting anthropological work, especially in the 20th century, by some French guys like Levi Brule and others that would be interesting commentary on this. Blah, 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 blah. All that the study of language does indicate is that they have come about as part of that historical process, which I have called contraction, whereas the use of metaphor always operates to expand meaning. Metaphor cannot, therefore, have been the original source of what Bentham called the inner language, though Bentham himself cheerfully assumed that it was. That was why he distinguished so subtly in the second sentence of the passage quoted on page 32. If he had kept his gaze firmly fixed on the evidence afforded by language itself, he would have written, quote, so he's modifying the original quote, to every word that has an immaterial import there belongs also, or at least did belong, a material one. To every word that has a material import there belongs also, or at least did belong, an immaterial one. So what Barfield is saying here is that there used to be this very deep connection in language between the inner and the outer that is there everywhere we look. And we can find it in primitive language today. We can find it in older language. And so there's this deep connection between those two things. And to assume that because we've seen this process whereby they have become separated today, to posit that into the past without real evidence of it is a big, it's sort of a flight of fancy. It's not really connected to any real evidence. So whereas what Bentham did write was not that to every word that has an immaterial import there belongs also an immaterial one, but that to every word that has an immaterial import there belongs, or at least did belong, a material one, because this is to bolster his case that words start out as having simple material meanings, or even I guess, philologists would assume that words come about as sort of like grunts or just sounds that are made by, our monkeys or primates that are preceded humans, and versions of our ancestors and predecessors that that transmit these grunts into more and more refined elements that have specifically outer meanings, because that must be how they would come about, because they're if they're pointing at something, it has to point to the outer world. In the same way, Herbert Spencer, Max Muller, and others in the 19th century described with confidence what they called the metaphorical period in the prehistoric development of language, a period during which this inner language supposedly made its first entry on the linguistic stage, a period assumed to be already comfortably furnished with a vocabulary that was exclusively quote-unquote outer in its reference. There was no warrant for this in the study of language itself, and it must be added that there was no evidence for it in any other study. It was all pure speculation. All the same, this fancy picture of the way in which language developed in its early stages is still endemic, though. People no longer speak in express terms of a metaphorical period. The most one can say is that the number of people who have discarded it is slowly growing. In Cassirer's philosophy of symbolic forms, and Bruno Smel's discovery of the mind, and R.B. Onion's origins of European thought, and elsewhere, not to speak of anthropological studies in the semantics of primitive speech, you'll find quite a different picture, supported this time by carefully collected linguistic evidence. Even so, the other one remains. In a book called History and Origin of Language, which appeared in England in 1961, that viewpoint was simply taken for granted. And from the use he makes of the term metaphor to cover all kinds of figurative language at all stages of its growth, it appears to be one of Dr. I.A. Richards' concealed premises that all figurative language originated as metaphor. Yet it is, I have tried to show, only possible to maintain this as long as you have failed to realize that all language is or has been figurative, for otherwise you would be committing yourself to the statement that language itself originated as metaphor, which is clearly nonsense. In other words, and I'm not sure exactly what he means that be nonsense, because I think what he's saying there is that language can't originate as metaphor because you need to have language in place before metaphor is possible. So to say it just originated as metaphor is kind of that's problematic. In other words, any such concealed premise must be an illusion. And just as I believe we shall not get very far with the problem of meaning until we approach it historically, so I am also persuaded that we shall not get very far with the historical approach itself until we have got rid of that illusion. I shall therefore return to it later.